All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content from across the Jewish community every week before Shabbat. I'm Joe Hyman, the young adult programmer at JW3, and as you've probably seen, our building is very much closed. But JW3 is more than just a building, and we think that we have to bring content out to you online and continue this amazing project here. For those who haven't met us in person, JW3 is the cross-communal Jewish Centre in London. We are partnering to bring you this wonderful program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. This series will ask educators and leaders from across the Jewish community about surprising pieces of Jewish wisdom for our time. Each week we'll share a beautifully designed source sheet on the comments below and show it up here as well to carry some questions with you into Shabbat. To ask your own questions, please comment on our live feed below, and we will take them towards the end. Before I introduce our incredible educator, I'd like to take a moment to dedicate our learning to co-founder of Limmud, Jonathan Benjamin, who sadly passed away this week. It's his spirit and his strength that started Limmud back in the 80s with the other co-founders, and why so many of us are able to enjoy its presence in the community right now, and are able to be joined today by our illustrious and wonderful Rabbi Avi Strausberg, the Director of National Learning Initiatives at Hadar. She is based in D.C, and she is my own teacher, which is very, very exciting. Rabbi Avi recently completed Daf Yomi and took part in our very own Jacqueline Nichols' Siyum, but with a difference. Rav Avi did a haiku for each page of the Talmud, and it's a really wonderful project. Welcome, Rav Avi. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to be, as Joe said, he was my student this summer, an incredible student at that. And so I'm so honored to be a part of this project, especially overseas. It's great to be zooming into you before Shabbat.
Thank you. It's actually morning where Rav Avi is now, 8 o'clock, which is really, really wonderful that you've up and ready to teach some Torah. Tell us, what is the text that surprises you, and why does it surprise you? What makes you think the Torah says what when you look at it?
Amazing. So we just jump right in and do the learning on the text now?
Yes, please.
Okay. I just want to say, I thought the framing for this series of the Torah says what, poignant and surprising Torah, is just such a brilliant framing. And it was such a great opportunity to think like, well, what are really, it seems like all of the teaching that we should be doing as teachers should be in the category of surprising and poignant. So I think that this prompt might reframe like the rest of the Torah that I teach going forward. So the piece that we're going to be looking at is a Gemara from Brachot, and it's going to be a playful reading on a line from Psalms. So the line from Psalms comes from Psalm 119. It says in Psalms, Et lasot leHashem hefiru toratcha. A time to act for God or to do the work for God, they violated your teaching. And so I think in the context of Psalms, sort of the straight meaning of that verse is it's time to act now for God, because there are these people who have rebelled against God and who have not acted according to what God wanted. And so now, because these people violated God's ways, it's on us to act now for God and to restore God's words. I think that in context is the way we would understand what that verse means. But Brachot and the Gemara and then the later rabbis are going to take that verse in a totally different direction. Okay, so we'll dive into the Gemara now. So the preface for this Gemara, I should say, is that there's this idea, as we know from the Ten Commandments, it says, generally it's do not take the Lord's name in vain. And we understand that generally to be a strict interpretation to be about taking an oath. Don't swear an oath and use God's name in vain when taking that oath, and such desecrating or doing this thing to God's name, lowering God's name. But even the Rambam and other rabbinic scholars understand it to be not just about desecrating God's name in an oath, but really anytime you mention God's name unnecessarily, just sort of casually saying God's name, it's a lowering of God's name. So there's this already, before we get to the Gemara, there's an established rabbinic principle that not only should you not take God's name in vain in an oath or in some sort of like, clearly if you're saying something problematic or, cursing or something like that, but even just to, if you were casually saying God's name, that's also problematic. So that's a given for this Gemara. Okay, that said, we learn in the Gemara in Brachot 54a, V'hitkinu sheyeh adam shoelet shalom chaviro b'shem. And the sages established that a person should ask after the well-being of his fellow or his friend b'shem, using God's name, which should be really surprising because we've just said no one should even casually mention God's name. And now we're saying just when you're greeting another fellow human being, you should be using God's name, sort of like a throwing around of God's name. So what does it mean to greet someone using God's name? Now we're going to get a few examples. V'hine Boaz ba mebeit lechem vayomar lekotzrim Hashem imachem vayomru lo yivarechecha Hashem. So when Boaz in the book of Ruth would come in from Beit Lechem, he would say, Hashem imachem, the Lord is with you, saying God's name. And they would say back to him, also using God's name, may God bless you, Yivarechecha Hashem, okay? And we also see another occurrence in the book of Judges, Vayera elav malach Hashem, Vayomer elav Hashem imcha gibor hachayil, that when the angel in the book of Judges, the angel of God would appear, the angel of God said, Hashem imachem, God is with you, valiant soldier. So even not only are Boaz, you might have said, well, the people are doing it and they don't know the proper way, but even the angel of God is using God's name and asking after the welfare of other people. And so this should be really surprising because we know the rabbinic principle that you shouldn't be using God's name unnecessarily. So how do we solve this problem? And then the Gemara goes on to say, and this is surprising because we know this other verse that says at the same time, Shema le'avicha ze yiladecha ve'al tavuz ki zakna imecha. It quotes this other verse and says, unless you think for a second that you shouldn't be asking after the welfare of other people using God's name, we have a verse that says, listen to your father. This is the one that brought you to life. Don't disparage the wisdom of your elders, right? The elders have set a precedent that is asking after the well-being using God's name in it. And you shouldn't be so quick to write that off. There's actually wisdom in it. So we have to take it seriously that they're doing it. So now how do we rectify it? Because now we have a problem because rabbinic principle says, don't use God's name unnecessarily. And we have this wisdom being passed down, which is our forefathers, our elders, they would use God's name and asking after the well-being of one another. So here's the resolution. The Omer, it says in Psalms, Et lasot lashem hefir tortcha. A time to act for God, they violated the Torah. And how does Rabbi Natan read it? Rabbi Natan says, Omer hefir tortcha mishum et lasot lashem. He flips the verse in its head and he says, they violate your Torah because it is time to act for God. So this is where the radical part of the text comes in. Originally, what we thought that verse from Psalms meant was there are people that are violating your Torah. And so now it is time to act for God and to protect your Torah. And Rabbi Natan is saying, no, that's not what the verse means. Rabbi Natan is saying, you should violate God's Torah. Why? Because it is time to act for God. That sometimes, what does it mean to act for God? Sometimes acting for God requires that we violate God's Torah. A radical idea. And in case this wasn't like, in case you were reading Brachot and you weren't blown away, there's a Rashi on this. Rashi just really spells it out. So Rashi says, what does it mean that a person should ask after the well-being of his friend using God's name, in the name of God? Velo amrinan, we don't say mizalzelhu bichvoto shel makom. We don't say that this is disparaging the holiness of God. Bishvil kavod habriot leotzi shem shemayim alav. We don't say that by using God's name, we're sort of disparaging God for the sake of kavod habriot, for the sake of the dignity of human beings when we deploy God's name in this greeting. And I'll just one more line from Rashi and the next one, the Omer Eitla. So what does it mean that it is a time to act for God? Pa'amim shemevatlim divrei Torah kedei lasot lashem. Sometimes we actually violate and cancel the words of Torah in order to act for God. And then why do we do this? It's because we're already commanded in the Torah that we should bikei shalom v'radfehu, that we should seek peace and we have to pursue it. And so, mutar lehafir Torah ve'lasot devar hanireh asor. And because we are commanded by God in the Torah to seek peace and go after it, it is permissible. It is permissible to violate Torah and to do something hanireh asor that seems to us forbidden. So I just think that last line is really interesting, that it's here, there's sort of in the beginning, I think we might have thought it's permissible to do something that is actually forbidden. And I think what Rashi is saying here is sometimes we think the Torah is telling us to do something. It seems forbidden to us, but it's just that it seems forbidden. It's not actually forbidden because it can't be, because actually we're required to act against it for the sake of the Torah. So what at first glance we might say, it seems like the Torah is telling me that that thing is forbidden. It's just our perception of it. And we have to think again to think, what does it really mean to act for God?
Wow. Wow. If there was a text that was unexpected, that is it, I'd say. Something that tells you to kind of overturn, to violate the laws of the Torah, something that lots of people speak about doing and do, but with fear. And I think it's amazing to see this content coming from the rabbis themselves, that they were grappling with this idea themselves. That is unexpected and really powerful. Wow, it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to think about the limits of this text, a lot of things about the power of this text. I'm going to take some questions. So if anyone wants to post a question below, I've got a couple already. So let me just have a quick look. Okay, all right. I'm going to just throw out this one. This is like we'll address the crux of how this text can be used maybe dangerously in a second, but we'll go in with the first one. This is a question. How do you see this actually being used? What areas of halakha, of Jewish law and community, do you feel this text could be used for the good? And yeah, please let's just share a bit about that.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, first of all, I want to say, like, this is such a quick teaching on this concept, and it is, Joe, I think as you're alluding to, I think it's a very powerful tool that could be used. And I think it's also a potentially scary tool that could be used. And so to really do this huge idea of violating the Torah for the sake of God's work, which is like a major concept, to really do it any justice, I think I would want to do a full survey of, this is just one example where the rabbis use it. They actually use this in other places. And so I'd want to do a full survey to see, well, what are the circumstances in which the rabbis are using this? What are the moments in which they think, well, the Torah is telling me to do one thing, but really I have to violate that? So in order to really think about how might we begin to apply it in our lives and into what situations, I'd want to do a survey of how the rabbis were applying it and then think, how is that relevant? That said, in general headings, I think this Rashi is particularly helpful. So part of the reason why I like this example is this is an example of kavod habriot. This is an example of human dignity in which we're using God's name. We're doing something that is forbidden, of using God's name casually, but we're sort of, to the extent that we're violating Torah, the thing that we're violating Torah for the purpose of upholding the dignity of another human being and sort of honoring them in their fullness of their self. And I think also the language of the Rashi there, using why is it okay to do this, according to the Rashi, why is it okay to violate it? Because it's built into the Torah that we have to seek shalom, we have to seek peace and pursue it. And so I say the overall category headings of what are the circumstances in which I think it might make sense to lean on this. There might be moments where we seem to, because I want to put that in quotes, because what Rashi is saying, it might seem forbidden, but it's not, where we might seem to violate Torah, and we would do it for the sake of upholding another human being's dignity and for the sake of peace. And so some of those things, just sort of in broad category I would say there might be things around LGBT identity, trans identity, perhaps even thinking about agunot, women who are rabbinically trapped into marriages, are not able to be released from marriages. A major kavod briot, compassion, dignity. So I would say instances in which it seems like halakha is requiring us to really violate another human being's dignity. Those might be the exact circumstances in which, to really do the work of God, we might have to seemingly violate Torah.
Wow. Yeah, those seem incredibly important and are incredibly important areas where this could benefit so many lives. And it's wonderful to hear you say that. With this kind of background of the text, and the rabbis struggle with it. I wonder if you think that this text is asking us to only do this when we come into kind of conversation or come into disagreement with other values in the Torah, like kavod habriut, human dignity, or is this saying when you have an intuition or when you have a sense of morality that you have been brought up in a Western world or in a different culture to that of the Jewish text morality, is this text allowing for us to give our own sense of morality into this conversation, or is it just saying, when you've got two values of kavod habriut and saying God's name, no, actually you can break them, and I think that's where I fear in terms of the limits of this.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, that gets into again a much larger conversation. Is there a morality outside the morality of the Torah? Which is a hard question to answer, and a really good question. But I think what I would lean into is there are some great teachings. Specifically, I'm thinking of some Hasidic teachings. I think the Kedusha Levi talks about this. There's some great teachings about the idea of sort of that when the Torah was revealed to us, it was revealed to us and was revealed to Moshe according to the capacity that we could receive it. And this meaning that the Torah wasn't fully revealed to us at Sinai because we couldn't have understood all the Torah at Sinai, that it couldn't have been revealed in its full capacity. And in that sense, that sort of leads into this idea of an ongoing revelation, that there are things in each successive generation that are revealed to us because we have a different or greater capacity to understand it, given the circumstances in which we're in. So that's sort of the first thing. And the second thing I would say, I've been teaching some Pirkei Avot this week as we're in the period now officially leading from Pesach to Shavuot. And I learned some great Torah from Midrash Shmuel on Avot, which is a collection of commentary, don't be misled, by a rabbi named Shmuel, not on the book of Shmuel, but specifically on Pirkei Avot, in which he's sort of narrowing in on, in the first couple of Mishnayot, it says Moshe kibel at the Torah from Sinai, that Moshe receives the Torah, but then when it's talking about the transmission from Moshe to Aharon, to the elders, to the prophets, to the great assembly, it uses the verb limsor, masar. Then Moshe passed it over, handed it down, and he says, what's the difference between kibel and masar? He says kibel reflects an incomplete transmission, that Moshe, as great as he was human, and no human could ever understand all of Torah. So Moshe received the Torah to the greatest of his abilities, but actually it was an incomplete transition. Kibel means didn't get all of it, whereas Masar means, well, once a human being had it, he could hand basically all of it over to the next generation and so on. And so also there in that language, I think it leaves room for us to understand that the Torah as it was handed down to us might have been an incomplete Torah that was filtered through sort of human ability of what we could understand. And so, yeah, Joe, I think that there's the possibility to say, as we are in shifting times, it's a dangerous thing to say, don't get me wrong. And I think we'd have to have a large conversation about the bounds and how we think about it. But I do think that there's room to think that there is an ongoing revelation. We have different capacities to understand. Our sense of morality may have shifted in context in different generations. And so that might leave some space for our own moral compass. And when we think about it, it might be necessary to apply this text.
Thank you. I think that's really, really interesting. And I think what I thought when you were saying that is the possibility for different people who haven't necessarily been part of the process of that ongoing revelation, at least of oral Torah, including women, including LGBTQ people, people who are disabled, voices that haven't necessarily been at the front of the conversation up till now. And I think that idea of an ongoing revelation that's in the present tense sounds really interesting in context. It's this verse.
It's funny that you mentioned the ongoing revelation, people who haven't been a part of it, because one of the other places where the rabbis use this teaching that they violated the Torah for the sake of the Torah is in the context of the prohibition to write down oral Torah. It was understood to be forbidden to write down oral Torah, I think in part because they wanted the oral Torah to remain alive and changing, and that it shouldn't be something that was sort of hard and codified. There's a moment in the Gemara where the rabbis do actually write down, it talks about the rabbis writing down the oral Torah, and they say, how could they do that? There's this prohibition, you're not supposed to write down oral Torah because it's supposed to be this live conversation. And the reason why is they wrote down the oral Torah so that the oral Torah wouldn't be forgotten. So for the sake of not forgetting the Torah, they wrote it down. But really, it was never supposed to be written down because it was always supposed to be this alive, changing conversation. So that also makes me wonder if that plays into this, is that we have this idea now of both the written and oral Torah being like set and we can't act against it. But had that oral Torah never been written down, we would have more of a sense of we're stepping into this process and conversation that sometimes I think we don't feel like that process is ongoing.
Completely. It's interesting that in that text about writing down the Torah, we see that a world could be completely different if the Torah was being passed down orally. I'd like to move forward in terms of how does this kind of text, how have you found this text to be helpful in conversations around the present day moment? There's been lots of rabbis and lots of organizations completely changing the way they view halacha for Chag, for the festivals or for Pesach. And it feels like a moment of saying, we overturn. I mean, it may not be an overturning from them. It may be, we're doing God's work to create a space that people can celebrate Jewish festivals in a way that feels dignified. But I wonder if that plays on your mind.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have to say, I think that speaks to sort of the power and the potential wide applicability of thinking about this teaching. I hadn't thought about it in the context of sort of some of the overturning that's happening today, but I think that you're totally right. That I think it's a brilliant application to think about, to the extent that we feel like some ways that we might have conventionally understood halakha is being violated for the sake of God's work, that work being giving people a sense of comfort, bringing people together, being able to say Kaddish, any of those number of those things. I think that that's a really interesting way to think about this. I think this sort of goes to, you sort of alluded to, like, there's the power and then there's what's the limit and what's the danger. The only thing I would say there, this is not at all reflective of what anyone is doing, but sort of the question there is, once you overturn Torah, can you come back from that overturning? So it's like, once we make all of these permissibilities of what is and isn't now acceptable on Chag and Shabbat and use of virtual minyanim and use of electricity and all of those things, this is a question. Is the overturning of Torah something that happens in the moment? And then once that moment is over, you sort of go back to the Torah where you were? Or once you overturn the Torah, is there something irrevocable that happens? There's for better or for worse, that once you overturn Torah, there's a chain that sets forward. And so that's just a question of what does it mean to Hifyor Torah? What does it mean to overturn Torah? And what are sort of the long lasting results of that? Completely.
Yeah. The danger does loom with this text in some sense as well. Yeah, completely. I'm thinking about the fact that even though the rabbis said this in the text, it was the rabbis that said it. And I think when we talk about it in light of our conversations today, we're very much talking about a much more mobilized, educated lay people. And it's just a thought, but just interested of how that would have played. I wonder if in the time of this conversation was happening, that these conversations the rabbis were having were based on actual realities of what people were doing on a day-to-day basis of saying God's name because they felt like it, or was it kind of a situation that the rabbis allowed them to, and hence they did? Or was it more
you're saying like who was leading? The rabbis making
Yes.
this saying it's okay, or they saw that the people were doing this and the rabbis are saying actually the people, right, in a sense, the people have a moral intuition that this is, even though we think this isn't the right way to use God's name, that the people's moral intuition of how do you really honor and raise someone up is correct, and that's why it's acceptable. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that you're right, that I think that there is a sense of the people leading. I think even in the text that we didn't look at, in which the recording of the oral Torah, I think what was happening there is not that the rabbis gave permission, but that the rabbis in the story who are featured, they needed to write down the oral Torah because otherwise they were going to forget it. And then I do think there was a sense that we had to figure out why that was okay. So that's, again, interesting, going to your point of sort of the moral intuition, who is leading it, that I do think that gives a place to say, with some of the, the permissibility of electronics and Zoom minyanim and Kaddish on Shabbat and Chag, and obviously during the week, is that I think that you're right, that the need for that is coming from people who are saying, we need to be able to gather, we need to be able to mourn together. And then it's rabbis having to figure out, okay, well, how might we get there in the halakha? Even though this seems forbidden, how might it be permissible?
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from our online audience. Thank you very much. I don't have the name of the person who shared it, but thank you. How could Moshe teach something to his disciples and to the extra generations below him that he did not understand fully? Could you just clarify, elaborate a bit more on that? Because I think it's an idea that people might feel it doesn't match up with what they feel about Moshe as this perfect transmitter of Torah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Moshe at the end of the day was a human being who did the best that he could, and he could only teach to the best of his capacity. So I think that could be a couple of things. I think it could be there were things that he might have just straight up missed, and maybe those things just didn't get handed down at all. And there might have been things that he heard, but he heard through his own human filter, and those things got filtered down through the human filter. I think that that's very real. I mean, Moshe, in many ways, God is sort of the ultimate parent. Moshe is subbing in for God as a parent, with his rebellious children in the wilderness. I think about that a lot as a parent. How can parents teach things that they don't really understand themselves? And that's, I think, a lot of what parenting is there's a lot of things that I understand as a parent. I've, been in the world a certain number of years, but, even like on a very basic level, handing over Judaism that I only have the understanding that I have, or how do I raise my kids to be decent human beings? I think what it means to teach is to do it to the best of your abilities, but to recognize a sort of fallibility that I might not have gotten it all right, or I'm teaching you, everything that I gather. I don't say this. First of all, this isn't my original teaching on Moshe, not sort of the limitations of Moshe, but I really don't understand. I don't understand it as a knock on Moshe. I understand it, if anything, as like Moshe is human like the rest of us, and he did the very, very best that he could do. But how could he possibly have understood all Torah? He was a human being.
Thank you. Completely. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from that particular reading, as we said before, about listening to those who have varied experiences, listening to what was Zipporah saying at the time when Moshe was passing over this. How did she receive the Torah from him, and did she see anything that wasn't around, etc., and hence oral Torah and all the discussions and arguments that ensue. It feels like this text is, in my kind of view as a 28-year-old person sitting here, wanting it to be something that really strengthens people who haven't been heard. It feels like it's a humbling element of the rabbis that say, no, we don't actually know everything, and there will be moments that we do have to overturn things. I want to just close and say thank you so much for sharing this unexpected piece of Torah. We've touched on revelation, inclusion, the limits of Torah, and the limits of how we can understand Moshe as imperfect leader. It's been really insightful, and I hope that our audience has found it as insightful as I have. It's a pleasure to learn with you, as always, and I'm glad that I can do this just so we can chat, basically. But thank you. If you have any final remarks, I'd love to hear them.
Just my total pleasure. I'm so thankful to be asked. And again, I think that the framing of surprising and poignant Torah, I'm so excited to see what other people share for the rest of the series. I think that this is such a great, this is what we should be looking for in our life, Torah that both surprises us and that touches us and that moves us. And so it's such an opportunity to get to learn a little bit with you.
Thank you. And tune in next week on Friday, where we'll have Lindsay Taylor Goodhart sharing her unexpected and poignant text. Shabbat Shalom, and please rest.